The presentation of Toledo Stories is made possible in part by Key Bank, celebrating the strength of our region's history and supporting the promise of its future. Key Bank, achieve anything. And by the generous financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Timothy Messer-Cruz from the University of Toledo. In this episode of Toledo Stories, we present the Toledo Zoo, A Living History, which originally aired in June of 2000. In 1912, the zoo was lacking one animal, which every zoo needed to be considered a proper zoo, an elephant. Then word arrived that an animal dealer in Missouri had a colossal elephant, Babe, for sale, but one with a checkered history, having already killed its circus keeper. Toledoans would not be deterred, and the city's school children began pooling their nickels and dimes to purchase Babe. Those children who donated a quarter or more were given a certificate good for 1 pound of elephant flesh, presumably when Babe would have to be put down. Toledoans loved their Babe, and those certificates were never redeemed, because when Babe finally died in 1943, his 5.5 tons were rendered into munitions to fight World War II, helping the city do its part for the war effort. And now, Toledo Stories presents the Toledo Zoo, A Living History.
Nestled in the arms of a South Toledo neighborhood stands one of the area's favorite institutions, the Toledo Zoo. Over the past 100 years, it has grown from a novel curiosity into one of the world's best zoos, due entirely to the unwavering support of the local community. Although constructed of bricks and mortar, earth and concrete, the zoo was literally built by the hearts and hands of local residents. The story of their lives make up a living history of the Toledo Zoo.
This is the era of Samuel Golden Rule Jones, the great reform mayor of Toledo. And it's an era of reform across the country. And part of that reform was to develop places of beauty and relaxation in the city. Beautiful architecture, grand spaces, boulevards, and parks, and places like zoos. People were already predisposed to going to Walbridge Park. You know, it was a beautiful park right along the river, and it was a very verdant and very lush place, lots of ravines, lots of trees. They would wander across the street where the historic zoo is now and go in the conservatory and go in the greenhouses. Pavilions started to show up where you could have picnics, and not long after the turn of the century, an amusement park was built. And it really made a beautiful setting. You know, there's this fancy conservatory and that beautiful shingle-style building at the other end of the greenhouses with towers on top, and then this fairly large fountain, and then the midway or the amusement park across the street, and the pavilions lining the river. So it was a very beautiful spot for people to go. So it was the logical place for the zoo to develop.
Well, the story goes that the first animal at the Toledo Zoo was a woodchuck. It was donated by Carl Hillebrand, a furniture dealer from South Toledo. And he donated it because the thing got loose in his store one day and just started tearing the place up. Woodchucks are rodents. They probably like to eat furniture. He couldn't have it in his store anymore, but he didn't want to kill it. So he gave it to Walbridge Park with the idea of starting a zoo. Apparently it was a pretty big woodchuck because a lot of people thought it was a bear. And the rumor got out that they had a bear on display at Walbridge Park. And the place was packed to see a woodchuck. And from that day on, we've had crowds at the zoo.
People started following the Hillebrand's lead and donating a variety of animals. By the end of 1900, there's about 39 animals out there at Walbridge Park. Mostly they were curiosities, what you'd call a menagerie. And there was no collecting policy, right? Just whatever came, they took. T.J. Zeems as the first keeper. And he really was the conservator of plants. He was there when the conservatory was built in 1904. And right about that time, then they decided to appoint him as like general groundskeeper, which included taking care of the animals.
Simple cages and pens housed many of the zoo's early exhibits. Although some of Walbridge Park's ravines were fenced at both ends for the larger animals, overall, most exhibits were very primitive enclosures, designed more for confinement than contentment.
Well, it was typical that animals were just put in a cage, with not much thought being given to how that would impact their quality of life. It was also a time when animals were actually hitched up to sleighs, and some of them they even put saddles on, tried to ride them. Essentially, they were looked at as amusements for humans. Louis Shear, who succeeded T.J. Zeems, was a very unique individual in the history of the zoo. He'd been raised on a farm in Ohio and obviously had an understanding of and an appreciation for animals. And this was translated directly to his care of the animals at the zoo. It was clear that he really loved the animals as opposed to just seeing them as a human amusement. Whether it was the pitch of his voice, whether it was his gentleness, his demeanor, or all of those things, we really don't know. But Babe, the giant elephant, could only be calmed on many occasions by Louis.
Babe was by far the most dangerous animal in the zoo. He had killed 2 men before he was in a circus. He killed 2 men there, and after he came here, he was donated to the zoo, he killed a keeper. A very dangerous animal.
Oh my, was he big. And Louis was 6 feet 2 or 3, I think. You could see him next to that elephant. The elephant's head of at least 2 or 3 feet higher than his head.
He was a magnificent, big bull. He was the biggest elephant in captivity at that time. Tremendous animal. And the only one that could handle him was Louis Shear. They'd take him down to railroad yards, and he'd move boxcars for him if they wanted to move. And tremendous sight, really. And people didn't really appreciate what they were seeing when they saw this elephant.
Louis would also take him down to be weighed down Broadway. There was an industrial scale, and once a year for many years, he walked him down Broadway.
And all he had was his hook with him. Everything would clear over the side when they saw Babe.
They kept him chained in some sort of a barn or something that's long since disappeared. But he'd get loose, and he'd go for walks through the neighborhood. Early in the morning, he stuck his trunk into a second-story window. Of course, he was tall enough to do it, and just scared the daylights out of the couple that were living there, were sleeping in the bedroom. He made some kind of a snort, and they woke up, and here was this elephant peering in the window.
A lot of times when I'd be coming home from school, we'd see Babe over in Walbridge Park all by himself. And we made sure he was by himself, because if Louis wasn't with him, well, then we ran like the very old devil to get home.
Even one of the local newspapers had an editorial cartoon showing animals running through the neighborhood, and with little captions, people saying, "Oh my gosh, here comes Babe, get the children," or something.
Percy Jones was a wonderful guy. He was very authoritative and very opinionated. And he was a very forceful power. He was the son of Sam Jones, Golden Rule Jones, who was mayor of Toledo for 16 years. He was a public figure. He had some political clout in the city here. And however, he was quite outspoken.
Louis Shear, who was the keeper at the time, Louis had gone to Percy Jones to raise some money for a hippopotamus pen, as I recall. And Percy said, I wouldn't give you money for that. You don't have a plan. You're not really housing those animals very well. I'm not going to give you money for that. Well, rather than taking it as a setback, Louis found a way to sort of manipulate that and talk Jones into becoming president of the board to deal specifically with those kinds of issues. Well, he turned the place around, literally. I mean, it starts to become a professional zoo when he takes over. He appoints Frank Skelden as secretary, curator, eventually gets the title director. Skelden is the business editor of the Toledo Blade. And the three of them, Louis Shear, the head keeper, Percy Jones, and Frank Skelden, really take that zoo to a completely different level and decide, essentially, to professionalize it.
With Louis Shear tending the animals, Jones and Skelden conducted a study of the world's best zoos and began designing long-term plans to redevelop the Walbridge Park grounds. They improved the infrastructure and built new facilities to house the growing animal collection.
There were some very nice buildings. There was the pachyderm building, and it held elephants and a hippo and I believe a rhinoceros at one time. And there was a carnivore building that was built in 1927, but again, it had the old barred cages, and they kept large primates like gorillas in there, chimpanzees. Also, they kept the usual, carnivores, lions and tigers and that kind of thing.
It was a nice building, pretty building. And unfortunately, the person who designed it had not consulted with someone who knew animals well. And not only were there bars in front to keep the animals inside in their cages, but between cages there were more bars. And sometimes one of the big cats would fall asleep and its tail would accidentally manage to get through the bars next door and promptly got bitten off by the neighbor. And we had the best collection of short-tailed big cat animals that you ever saw.
The new buildings and exhibits required trained personnel, so Percy Jones hired a young herpetologist named Roger Conant.
He paid for my railroad fare down to St. Louis and back 4 or 5 times so I could go down there and study their new reptile house and get ideas for an eventual one here. And then through his influence, we set up a temporary reptile exhibit in the hallway of the elephant house. And on weekends, when there were crowds of people, they were standing 4 and 5 deep trying to peer over each other's shoulders to see what was in the exhibit. I asked some of the zoo board members if they knew of any architect who might be interested in drafting some plans for a new reptile house. And fortunately there was. It was a firm, they had no work because the Depression was coming on rapidly, and they allowed me to go down and consult once a week with a chap by the name of Paul Robinette. And he and I worked together, and eventually we developed a set of plans, and that turned out to be an extremely valuable set of documents.
The popularity of the new buildings and exhibits boosted attendance, and the expansion continued. The Zoological Society opened the Herbivora, or Giraffe House, in 1928, and the zoo's first primate building a year later. The Monkey House was the final project before the stock market crash and the start of the Great Depression.
The Depression hits, and the zoo had all these wonderful plans for building buildings for animals. Well, that all comes to a halt.
The Depression hit Toledo especially hard. Unemployment soared above 50%, and the number of families on relief overwhelmed local social agencies. But in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president on the promise of federally funded relief programs. His New Deal created a series of agencies to fund public projects with federal money.
The WPA, Works Progress Administration, and the PWA, the Public Works Administration, and they had all these initials of all these different agencies. What they did is that the WPA took these people who were unemployed and they offered them a job where you could have a chance to work and earn money. Not a great deal, but it helped at least put a little food on the table.
What Roosevelt did was appoint military generals and so on as heads of these various relief efforts. So because they were good at organizing people and getting tasks done. And then things really start to happen.
Colonel John Shetler was assigned to Toledo. And the secretary of the Zoological Society, his name was Frank L. Skelden, who lived right across the street from the zoo, was assigned by the Toledo Blade to be Colonel Shetler's shadow. So the first thing they did was to go over in the park, and here were men, several dozen of them, raking leaves. And they raked all the leaves down to one end of the park, and then they turned around and raked them all back again. Colonel Shetler says, "Good heavens, this is ridiculous. Isn't there something worthwhile we can do around here?" And Skelden says, "Well, we have some plans at the zoo for a new reptile house." Shetler says, "Bring them to me. I want to see them."
From that point on, then the zoo becomes sort of the favored project in Toledo. Skelden makes it his business to put people back to work as part of that, implementing that zoo master plan. Not only does he get the money to build the buildings, but he also gets the money to tear buildings down to use to build the buildings at the zoo, as well as lots of infrastructure stuff, new heating and water lines and things that just would have taken forever to get done.
I think the most significant influence during that time was probably Frank Skelden himself. Because of his newspaper connections, he knew quite well several of the business and civic leaders, and he had such tremendous influence that he was able to leverage these materials when perhaps otherwise they might have been sold or simply discarded.
My dad would call people and say, "You need that building downtown, you haven't used it for a while?" And they'd say, "Oh, Frank, we can't afford to tear it down." And Dad says, "Well, that's all right, I got it half down already."
The neat thing about those materials is that they're all reused. I mean, these are the classic recycled buildings. Nothing, very little in them except maybe the wiring, and even I think probably some of the wiring was reused, but virtually everything in them was reclaimed. Masons, stone carvers, woodworkers, they basically retooled all of these materials and reconfigured them to the form that they needed for the zoo building. Particularly in the reptile house, you can see there's in the southern entrance to the building is a plaque there which talks about where all of the materials came from, the ceilings, the floors, the walls, even the wood for the cases.
They got lumber out of the old Wabash shops, some huge pine timbers that could not be duplicated even at that time. And they even found a huge walnut log lining the canal. It had been in there for 100 years perhaps. And black walnut even then was quite valuable. And the guardrails in front of the cages in the reptile house are made from that log.
They took material wherever they could find it, and fortunately, they were able to get some very impressive material, which aided in the transformation of that building into something that really grand rather than just another reptile building.
It was a work of art at the time, and it was done with loving care. And from that also sprang the Zoo Museum with its indoor theater, and then the great outdoor amphitheater, the birdhouse, and the aquarium were all built by the same crew working together.
These were uncommon buildings from the very beginning, and they were building them to be beautiful and to be unique.
Roger Conant's vision and the care that went into the design of the reptile building set the tone for what followed after it. And really it marked the transformation of the Toledo Zoo from a more or less sleepy little local facility to a zoo that had an international reputation. Those new additions to an already beautiful grounds really catapulted us into the forefront of what U.S. zoos were at the time.
Dozens of skilled Old World craftsmen brought the handmade buildings to life. Then a team of local artists, painters, and sculptors gave them a soul.
Artists were commissioned through the Toledo Museum of Art to paint naturalistic murals inside each of the cages. And these artists painstakingly painted lovely scenes that were on the inside of virtually every cage in the reptile building and the aviary.
The 4 large murals were painted at the Art Museum, and the wing was a new wing at the time that it wasn't finished on large, beautiful Belgian canvas. And some was 22 feet long. They painted on that, and then the idea was when it was finished, they could glue them to the walls in the reptile house. But then later on in the smaller cages, they just painted right on the walls.
As we were looking at the 50th anniversary of the reptile building in 1984, and looking at the state of some of the murals in that building that were peeling and coming off from the wall, had flaking paint, we found out from one of our staff members that one of the original artists, that is Woody LaPlante, was still alive. Woody LaPlante was able to come in and restore the old WPA murals in the reptile buildings. He did a fantastic job, and what a legacy he and others like him have left.
The legacy of the WPA workmen is still vibrant today. Their talent and dedication to the zoo visible in the bricks and mortar that hold the historic buildings together and in the loving detail that adorns them. But the skill and commitment of hundreds of WPA laborers is epitomized by the remarkable work of one man, stone artisan Arthur Cox.
Arthur Cox, for me, summarizes the dedication that was present in most, if not all, the WPA workers. Arthur Cox was a stone cutter from England, and he was commissioned to do several stone carvings that existed as individual statues outside the building, but also the friezes and lunettes that made up the archways over the buildings. Arthur Cox, however, was dying of silicosis. He had the WPA administrators have the stone delivered to his house so that when he could drag himself out of bed, he could resume work on it. So although he was dying and too ill to travel to the site, his skill and dedication was such that he worked from his sickbed to complete what animals he could.
People are in love with those animals, and to many people it isn't a complete trip without having your picture taken on the animal. Kids are always on that thing, even in wintertime. So that's very much a part of the heritage of the zoo, and very much a legacy from Arthur Cox, who never lived to see them all completed. But we'd like to think that he knows how popular those animals have been.
In addition to the artists and craftsmen who built the zoo, the WPA also enlisted musicians. They formed their own orchestra and performed all over town, but are best remembered for their concerts in the zoo's amphitheater beginning in 1936. The Twilight Concerts soon became known as Music Under the Stars, and they've been going strong ever since.
Music Under the Stars is another Toledo institution. I refer to that as Toledo's version of the Boston Pops, and it really is, and Sam Zor is Mr. Music.
It's just marvelous. I mean, it's a marvelous setting for theater. That shell built by the WPA is a blessing. That really is gorgeous. As they walk in, the sun is shining and it's gorgeous. But by 8:30 it's dark. And so I think they like that. And then you get the stars. I don't know if I'm not looking at the stars, but I'm sure they're out. They're always out. Stars are always out. It's just those clouds that don't.
This zoo benefited tremendously from the efforts of Jones and Skelden in pushing forward this massive relief plan on up through the 40s. 40s, both Percy and Frank pass away, and that's kind of the end of that era.
Following the death of Frank Skelden, another newspaperman, Toledo Blade outdoor editor Lou Cluer, took over as zoo director. An avid outdoorsman and adventurer, Cluer led a team from Toledo on a safari to South America. Cluer, Dan Danford, Phil Skelden, and Jungle Larry Tetzloff brought back more than 200 birds, snakes, and other assorted animals. The trip was sponsored by the newspaper and made headlines for weeks, and the explorers were welcomed home by thousands of excited zoo visitors. Beginning with the Pony Ring and Bunnyville, a miniature town built just for rabbits, some of the zoo's most popular attractions have been developed with its youngest visitors in mind. The baby boom of the 40s and 50s marked the emergence of a number of other children's attractions at the zoo. The zoo's safari train boarded its first passengers in 1946. Since then, 4 different zoo chews have chugged their way through the grounds, delighting thousands of children of all ages. Although the live pony ring was ultimately replaced by carousel horses and a helicopter ride, neither could surpass the excitement of a trip to Wonder Valley.
It was one of the most popular of all zoo exhibits at the time in the 1950s, which was sort of the ultimate children's zoo. It was down in one of those, that sort of last remaining ravine right next to the amphitheater. And it was a place where it was your first stop at the zoo if you had kids. You went right to Wonder Valley.
We had, like, the baby elephant was down there. We had a St. Bernard dog that was a friend of everybody. And we had ducks and chickens and rabbits and everything that the kids could hold and handle. And then we had Galapi, the big Galapagos tortoise that was down there. And people would get on him and ride. They wouldn't go very far, but they would at least say they had a ride on the big tortoise.
That and the talking storybooks. Anybody sort of the baby boomer era remembers Wonder Valley and the talking storybooks, where you bought a little key, a plastic key, and you could put it in this metal box and turn it, and this continuous loop tape inside the box would tell you the story of that animal. They were basically little elephants with a snout sticking out. And I even remember that. It was one of the hottest things that a kid could do, was to have his or her own key.
In 1953, Lou Cluer resigned, and Frank Skelden's son Phil became the zoo's first full-time paid director. After growing up in the shadow of the zoo, Phil Skelden stepped into familiar shoes. He oversaw the construction of new exhibits, the arrival of the zoo's first gorilla, and other improvements. But he may be best remembered for causing an international incident with his capture of a runaway sea lion. In June 1958, just prior to their grand opening, the Storybook Gardens Amusement Park in London, Ontario, reported the escape of a California sea lion named Cyril. He swam down the Detroit River into Lake Erie and up the Maumee. After a 3-day chase, he was shot with a tranquilizer dart by Phil Skelden and captured near Port Clinton. Skelden brought Cyril back to the Toledo Zoo, and that's when the trouble started.
To me, it was one of the great publicity stunts in Toledo history. And they didn't even have to plan it. I mean, it just sort of happened naturally.
Earl Nichols was the president of the commission up there, and he called. And he said, I understand that you caught a sea lion down there. And I said, yes, we did, Earl. And he said, I think it's ours. Can we have it back? And I was coached well. I said, no, I don't think so. I think in sea lore, that it's finders keepers. If you find something out there in the ocean or something, it's yours if you find it.
Phil Skelden never intended to keep the slippery sea lion, But both the Toledo Zoo and the brand new Storybook Gardens Amusement Park quickly recognized the potential effects of a very public custody battle.
In the media, of course, it was a frenzy. They just fed on it and demanded it work. They had the largest attendance on the Sunday before Cyril was sent back. And it all had a wonderful resolution, even right back to the very end when they got back to Storybook Gardens. I mean, apparently the crowds lining the Ambassador Bridge and the highways in Canada were so thick they had to close everything down because they couldn't handle any more traffic while this caravan of cars from the Toledo Zoo with Cyril inside came by.
Thanks to Cyril, Phil Skelden was an international celebrity, but to most Toledoans, Dan Danford was the face of the zoo during the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Dan was the Marlin Perkins of Toledo, Ohio. Dan was the guy, as our curator of mammals, who took the zoo out to the public. He visited countless schools and school children. In fact, a couple of generations grew up with Dan Danford. He did TV shows, he did radio shows. Dan was Mr. Zoo.
Kids especially related to this kind gentleman. Most children, myself included, have a very powerful memory of Dan Danford being the front man for the zoo.
Even though Dan was never the director of the zoo, I think an awful lot of people in Toledo thought of him as the director of the zoo because he was the guy that they saw for so many years.
The 50s marked a dramatic increase in zoo membership thanks to the arrival of business manager Joe Bissonette.
My dad was a very good zoo director, but Joe Bissonette was a salesman. He started out on the weekend selling popcorn there, and pretty soon he was outselling all the concession stands in the zoo. And so when my dad became the zoo director, Joe came in as the business manager. And during Joe's tenure, the membership sales at the zoo skyrocketed to where, per capita wise, we were the largest membership of any zoo in the country. Now that kind of support for the Toledo Zoo still exists today. But if you look at the progress and the growth of the Toledo Zoo, at every point you had somebody in there who was a real good animal man, but you also had somebody in there who was a salesman or a huckster, somebody who could get the public excited every week to come on out and see what's new at the zoo. And during my dad's tenure, that role was filled better than I think anybody else in the country could fill it by Joe Bissonette.
The 60s and 70s brought new and improved exhibits. Cheetah Valley was an immediate hit with both its visitors and its residents. Soon the zoo family welcomed a litter of cheetah cubs, the first ever raised by their mother in captivity. And in 1979, the rare mammal building became the new home for the zoo's primates, offering visitors a close-up view of some of their favorite animals. But years of reliance on city funding were taking their toll.
In the 70s, the city runs into problems financially, not just with the zoo, but throughout the city. And the zoo really suffers because it's viewed as non-essential. So Skelden is really faced with some significant challenges through the mid and late 70s.
The first thing that we noticed here at the zoo in the mid-70s was no capital money at all. We couldn't fix a roof, we couldn't fix leaky pipes, nothing like that. There was just no money available. There was a capital improvements levy that was passed in 1980. At the time, no one foresaw what was going to happen to the city of Toledo after 1980. So the levy passed in the fall of 1980, and almost immediately the city had to start laying people off. So the zoo found itself in a place where they had money to repair the buildings, to build new exhibits, but they didn't have the money to hire employees or pay for employees, pay for utilities, pay for animal food, animals. None of that could be taken out of the capital levy.
Adding to the uncertainty was the retirement of Phil Skelden as director of the zoo in December of 1980. Curator of Reptiles, Bill Denler, was chosen Skelden's successor.
I guess you could say I was in the right place at the right time. Some people might say at the wrong time, because the roof was falling in. There's no question about it at the time I became director of the zoo. But I didn't look at it that way. I saw tremendous opportunities ahead for the zoo. I really felt then that it was only a temporary problem that we were facing with the city. But I also was realistic enough to know that something had to change.
Well, the city kept cutting and cutting and cutting until it got to the point where the zoo couldn't remain open or closed. I mean, it didn't have enough people to keep the animals fed and housed and whatnot. And it was really in dire danger of closing.
Tom Anderson, who was on the board of the Toledo Zoological Society at the time, stepped in and went to the local businesses in town and convinced everybody that they couldn't let the zoo die.
The city was, of course, strapped, and we suggested that the city tide us over for a year or so and give the zoo, either leasing or selling the zoo to the society, and let the society then go to the county and see if we could arrange for an operating levy and put us on our own feet. It passed by a wide margin, and that permitted the zoo then to borrow against anticipated tax receipts and was back in business.
With the financial support of area voters, the zoo developed a new master plan. It renovated the historic WPA buildings and began redesigning older exhibits with greater emphasis on the well-being of the animals as well as the visitors.
We had more and more people coming to us and saying, why did the cheetahs have big open exhibits outside, off of the concrete, and yet all the other cats have to live in the old lion house? And they were right. And that's why we started eliminating the barred exhibits and moving all the animals out to open enclosures. The African savanna, without a doubt, was the most important thing, I think, in recent history for the Toledo Zoo. That's what really turned us around. That's what really defined the zoo of the 21st century. These types of exhibits today we call landscape immersion exhibits. And the idea is the visitor is actually immersed in the animal's landscape. Part of the idea is psychologically we wanted people to think they were visiting the animals' homes so that they would treat the animals with a little more respect. Up until the time that we opened that exhibit in the mid-'80s, no one had ever built a successful hippo exhibit in a zoo with filtered underwater viewing of hippopotamus. When we did that, it totally transformed the Toledo Zoo. Lucky for us, Bubbles and Cupid, the two hippos that have been in that exhibit from its beginning and have been at the zoo over 40 years, the two of them, they had an offspring in the new exhibit, and we were fortunate that it was during the day. We were able to capture the birth, which is underwater, with hippos. We were able to capture it on video, and to date, as far as I know, it's the only example of video footage of the birth of a hippopotamus. That, probably more than anything else, put the zoo back on the map internationally. We took all the animals that we could out of the elephant house and the carnivore building and put them in the African savanna. As it turned out, the vast majority of the animals in both buildings were African species. So we were able to do that. We were able to build a brand new 4.5-acre natural enclosure exhibit and remove the animals from the other two buildings. Then we were faced with the problem of what to do with those buildings. The older buildings, I think, are the legacy. They're the things that we're so proud of here at the zoo. They're what really set this zoo apart from other zoos.
Building on its history, rather than tearing it down, the carnivore house was transformed into the Carnivore Cafe, a unique dining experience that put the visitors inside the cages and behind bars.
The basement of the carnivore building was the zoo's original commissary. and that's where all the food was prepared for the animals in the zoo. That building is representative of probably every lion house in North America and the majority of them in Europe. Those are what zoo buildings looked like in the 1920s across the world. Too many zoos have torn those buildings down when they could have had another use, and the Carnivore Cafe has been extremely successful. When we saved the cafe, the decision was made that we absolutely had to save the elephant house. It was a beautiful building, the same type of architecture as the Carnivore Cafe. But one of the things we noticed after the cafe opened was lots of people, individuals, companies, etc., asked us if they could rent the cafe for parties. Well, in order to rent the cafe, that would have meant we would have had to close the restaurant during the day to our visitors. We didn't want to do that. So we started looking around for another place that we could rent for these kind of private parties, bring some revenue into the zoo, and lo and behold, there it was, right next door.
The Elephant House, originally designed to house big animals, was retooled to host big parties and renamed The Lodge.
It's been extremely successful. It's the hub of our catering operation. It's our #1 most requested rental facility, all this in just 2 years.
If you grew up in Toledo, chances are your childhood memories of the zoo include riding the safari train, sitting on the stone elephant, and feeding the animals. But that was a tradition that zoo officials had to stop.
A lot of people would come in, well-meaning people, and feed the right foods, lettuce and celery and carrots, but an awful lot of people would throw popcorn and peanuts and marshmallows and candy and who knows what else to the animals. So a member suggested that we have a contest to not only educate the children, but the parents of Toledo as to why it was a bad idea to feed the animals. So that's what we did, and it turned out to be an absolutely brilliant idea because by starting with the school-age kids, we were able to hit everybody. So for the first couple of years of the program, it wasn't uncommon to see an adult start to feed something to an animal, and then the child would go, "No, Mom," or "No, Dad, you're not supposed to do that because it's bad for them." And they did the education for us. They told their parents not to feed the animals.
The changes at the Toledo Zoo were being noticed, not only by the members and local residents, but by the zoological community the world over. It gave the Toledo Zoo a very prestigious reputation, which in 1988 earned it the rarest of opportunities, the loan of giant pandas from China.
Well, the panda exhibit, without a doubt, was our most infamous exhibit in the zoo's history. First of all, at the time that we exhibited the pandas, 1988, the only zoos that had been able to bring pandas in on short-term loans in this country were San Diego and the Bronx in New York, two of the biggest, most prestigious zoos in the world. All kinds of other zoos, Chicago, St. Louis, Atlanta, wanted to get pandas. But along came little Toledo, Ohio. In fact, it's ironic, when we went to China for the first time in 1987 to talk about panda loans, the Chinese had heard of the Toledo Zoo because of the Hippocarium, because of all the international publicity that we got with that exhibit. And we're the ones who got them before anybody else did, thanks to Ed Bergsmark.
I was trying to figure out something that would be unique, that would kind of push us up to the next level at the zoo. And so that, I thought would be a tremendous thing. And I felt that, if it was obtainable, we ought to take a shot at it. I think everyone thinks pandas are, the sweet and the most wonderful bears in the world. And so there's a personal appeal. Bringing pandas here and the ability to be able to build an exhibit that was world class. And the support of the community behind it. And it was an opportunity for everyone in the Midwest to come and see an endangered species that you could only see in the Washington Zoo.
Our exhibit was extremely controversial at the time. Little did we know when we got into it how big a deal would be made out of this exhibit. The World Wildlife Fund ended up suing the zoo over the exhibit. And it wasn't so much that they were suing the Toledo Zoo, they were suing the idea of animals being used for commercial purposes.
it brought to the front stage the issue over endangered species and so forth. And so the fight we had with the World Wildlife put us in the middle of the national newspapers and in the courtroom. And, you know, our concern was everything we were doing was to enhance saving pandas.
The end result was we still had our exhibit. We drew over 1 million people. And a lot of that, I think, was due to the publicity, because national publicity was generated. We had people from all over the world, all over this country, who thought it might be the last time they would ever be able to see pandas on exhibit. And that's one of the reasons they all came. The tragedy, to me, of the panda exhibit is that the panda loan to Toledo, sadly, was the last loan of pandas until just a year and a half, 2 years ago, when San Diego was able to get another loan, and the Atlanta Zoo now has a pair of pandas also on loan. And now we're back to where we were in 1988. And I'm delighted to see that the Chinese are working with other zoos to try to do something to increase the chances that pandas will be around another couple of generations at least.
One of the most popular exhibits to come along in the 80s was a modest plan designed to boost attendance during the slowest months of the year. But The Lights Before Christmas was an immediate and surprising success.
Back in the mid-'80s, 1986 to be exact, a couple of us came up with the idea of lighting the zoo up at Christmas time. And what it grew out of is a number of us grew up in the 40s and the 50s, and we remembered everybody lighting up their houses and the friendly competitions that neighborhoods have over who had the best light displays. And we decided, well, let's give it a try. People remind us of the Christmas lights year-round. They look forward to them. Early on, maybe our third or fourth year, people were calling it a Toledo tradition. So it's amazing. Our light display continues to grow every year, and it continues to amaze me. It's certainly one of the best things that we've ever done for the community.
The role of modern zoos has evolved, from human entertainment to animal preservation, and now to more active involvement in conservation efforts, both around the world and in our own backyard.
The same developmental pressures that imperil species in other places also act to endanger species in the Toledo area. We saw it as our responsibility to embrace not only international but also local conservation programs, and hoping also when we did this we could bring some perspective to citizens of Toledo on what an incredible ecological gem they have in the oak openings, which has more rare species than any place else in the state.
Once native to this area, Karner blue butterflies had all but disappeared. But the Toledo Zoo, in cooperation with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources and other public and private organizations, are working to reintroduce the species into the Oak Openings Preserve.
Zoos as conservation organizations have changed fundamentally, and the emphasis on conservation in zoos is now working in the habitats themselves to take direct conservation action, which in most cases will have no benefit to an animal collection resident at the zoo itself. And the Karner Blue Project is one of these. We do not exhibit Karner Blues. People cannot see them, but because of our efforts, they are present back in the oak openings where people can enjoy them in the wild.
The 90s became a decade of innovation and growth for the zoo, as some of its most popular exhibits were remodeled or renovated. In the tradition of the African savanna, the rare mammal building was expanded into a larger, more natural setting and renamed the Kingdom of the Apes. The Primate Forest exhibit gave smaller monkeys and lemurs a new open-air playground near the African Lodge. The WPA-era aviary was also renovated in 1998 with its small hand-painted cages transformed into huge open-flight areas where birds and visitors interact. Even the conservatory got a facelift, recapturing the Victorian Beauty's original 1904 charm. A 10-year capital improvements levy was passed by Lucas County voters in 1995, funding the purchase of additional land north of the Anthony Wayne Trail. This allowed the old parking lot to be moved and a new zoo entrance to be built. A zoo gift shop was added, as well as a pedestrian bridge replacing the underground subway tunnel which used to ferry parents and their excited children from the parking lot to the zoo gates.
There isn't anybody who grew up in Toledo that doesn't remember as a child running through that tunnel, screaming and yelling, driving their parents absolutely crazy, and jumping up and down on the metal plate that was in the middle of the tunnel just to make as much noise as they could make. There also, I would hazard a guess, isn't a parent in Toledo that isn't glad it isn't there anymore, because the number of times I watched mothers or tried to help mothers who had one or two children in a stroller trying to navigate those two sets of stairs at either end of the wet tunnel. The bridge is such a different way to come into the zoo, and it's the way you really want to come into a place like the zoo. We deliberately designed the bridge so that it would have animal exhibits in it and views of animal exhibits. The bald eagle exhibit is at the one end, the north end of the bridge. You get a wonderful overview of the Arctic also from that end. And on this side of the zoo, the south end, you get a really good view of the African wild dog exhibit, and eventually down the road we hope to do a walk-through bird aviary, outdoor aviary, that you will only be able to access from the top of the bridge. You also get some great views of downtown and the Anthony Wayne Trail. That's why we left the tunnel glass, so that kids and adults could sit there and watch the cars go underneath it.
The expanded North Campus also allowed the construction of the zoo's newest exhibit, the Arctic Encounter, a state-of-the-art facility featuring unparalleled viewing of seals and polar bears.
Well, polar bears have always been a very popular animal at the zoo here, going all the way back to the early 1900s. Unfortunately, the way we exhibited them was not in the best interests of the animals. Polar bears in the wild cover a vast territory. It's not unusual for a polar bear to cover 30, 40 miles in a day. So they need a lot of stimulation, intellectual stimulation. When we started designing this exhibit several years ago, that was our whole goal, to design an exhibit that we could frequently change so as to make it constantly stimulating for the animals. We're building these exhibits totally with the animals in mind, and the animals' well-being, enrichment. We give them all sorts of things to do. In fact, we now have an animal behaviorist as a full-time position on staff, whose sole job is to work with the keepers, the curators, the veterinarian, to develop ways to stimulate the more intelligent animals that we have in the zoo that need that kind of stimulation. At the same time, it's good for the visitors because we're bringing out natural behaviors. They're seeing animals do things that they might be doing in nature, in captivity. Coming up in a couple of years, we'll be adding a wolf exhibit. That'll be the completion of the Arctic exhibits. Then after that, we're going to be adding an African grasslands exhibit, which may sound redundant with the African savanna. It actually is the next generation. For one thing, it's going to be a lot larger than any exhibit we've ever had here at the zoo. We found, much to our dismay, that the African savanna just wasn't big enough to hold zebras and other animals together. So we're going to do a 4.5-acre exhibit that'll be more than big enough, we hope, for a family of giraffes, zebras, number of other hoofed animals, birds, etc. It's going to be very exciting.
Continued community support has allowed the Toledo Zoo the freedom to become one of the world's best, with state-of-the-art facilities and personnel all working together to build a brighter future in the zoo's next 100 years.
We could not have done what we've done without the support of the people in Toledo. The taxpayers have been just unbelievable to support our tax levies, to allow the zoo to have this renaissance, to come back to the zoo that I think we were 50, 60 years ago. Definitely could not have done it without the people. Even the San Diego Zoo, which is so famous, I don't think means as much to the citizens of San Diego as the Toledo Zoo means to Toledoans.
I think the zoo, more than any other single institution in the city of Toledo, holds all those childhood memories that everybody can relate to, because not everybody went to the same school, not everybody lived in the same neighborhood, not everybody played on the same ball teams, but everybody as a kid went to the zoo at least once a year, and a lot of them 8 or 10 or 12 times a year. But they all had memories from those big animals when they were little kids. And those tend to be real big memories that stick.
People from the region just have a love affair with this place. They recognize continually its importance. They support it financially through passing levies. It's so literally intertwined with the history of this place and this city that it's hard to separate it from who we are. It defines us and we define it.
If you'd like to learn more about the Toledo Zoo, a good place to start is by checking out this book on the subject, The Toledo Zoo's First 100 Years, A Century of Adventure by Ted Ligabell. And I'm sure you can find that at your local bookstore or local branch library. It's widely available. There are also many resources to discover on the internet. The Toledo Zoo's own website, toledozoo.org, contains the history of the zoo, information about the animals at the zoo, and my favorite feature, the animal cams. Then you can go over to the Toledo's Attic website, just type in zoo in the database, and find postcards and articles and other views of the zoo from long ago. Of course, you can find links to all of these resources on the WGTE website at WGTE.org. Thank you for joining us. I'm Timothy Messer-Cruz for Toledo Stories. I'll see you next time.
To learn more about the history of Northwest Ohio, visit Toledo Stories online at WGTE.org. Explore a wealth of resources, including books on each program subject, internet sites, and interesting places to visit in our area. A video of the program you've just seen is available for $19.95. You can visit us online at WGTE.org or call us at 419-380-4613. The presentation of Toledo Stories is made possible in part by Key Bank, celebrating the strength of our region's history and supporting the promise of its future. Key Bank, achieve anything. And by the generous financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.